Hello everyone, my name is Rose Eason. I'm the Executive Director of gallupARTS, a 501c3 nonprofit arts council serving Gallup and McKinley County. I'm so happy to be here today doing a presentation on a New Deal mural for the Octavia Philin Public Library's 2021 Visual Storytelling Authors Festival. The mission of gallupARTS is to foster creativity, culture, commerce, and quality of life in Gallup and McKinley County through the arts. We serve about 20,000 artists and residents annually through over a dozen different programs, everything from 2 downtown art galleries, to artist talks, to art classes and workshops, to youth art programs, to art festivals, to public art projects. One of our major ongoing long-term projects is the Gallup New Deal Art Project, which is an effort to build a virtual art museum showcasing Gallup and McKinley County's really impressive and expansive New Deal art collection from the 1930s and 40s. We're currently working on our second National Endowment for the Humanities grant to prototype a virtual art museum, and we hope that within the next couple of years we will be able to publish it online as a website. We really believe in the importance of this project because it will, for the first time, bring the entire Gallup and McKinley County New Deal art collection together under one roof, so to speak, and make it fully publicly accessible as a rich and robust artistic, historical, and cultural resource, and as a tool for community building. As you'll see today, the artworks in the Gallup and McKinley County New Deal art collection have so much to tell us about the past and where we come from, and they create really unique and meaningful opportunities for reflection and dialogue. And in that way, the collection is a tremendous vehicle for strengthening our community ties and for bringing us together to do the work of imagining and creating a more equitable and empathetic future for all. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into what can fairly be described as the crown jewel of the Gallup and McKinley County New Deal art collection. It's a 2,000 square foot mural painted by Lloyd Moylan for the courtroom of the historic McKinley County Courthouse, which of course obviously is where I'm presenting from. And because the theme of this year's Authors Festival is visual storytelling, we're going to be taking some time to think about the concept of history as storytelling in relation to this mural. And we're going to be putting a constructively critical lens on what history is told, how history is told, and who is doing the telling of history. And in that process, we'll begin to unpack some of our collective historical baggage, the baggage that comes not just from the history and the facts and the events themselves, but from the stories that have been and that continue to be told around that history. Just quickly before we begin, I want to give a brief overview of the Gallup and McKinley County New Deal art collection. It includes over 150 objects. It has paintings, sculpture, furniture and decorative arts, murals, of course, and buildings. It's currently housed in 5 different locations, and it's under the purview of 3 different entities. The city of Gallup has some, and most of its holdings are on view at the Octavia Philin Public Library. McKinley County has some, and most of its holdings are on view here at the historic McKinley County Courthouse. And then some of the collection resides with the Gallup-McKinley County School District. The reason that Gallup and McKinley County have so much New Deal art is that Gallup was one of 4 federal art centers in the state of New Mexico during the New Deal. The Gallup Art Center operated from 1938 to 1943, and it became the nexus for the production, the display, and the collection of New Deal art within our community. So with that, we'll turn to the mural. Again, it's huge. It's 2,000 square feet. It's highly ambitious, both in terms of scale and in terms of scope. Lloyd Moylan aimed to tell the history of our region of Northwest New Mexico from prehistoric times all the way through the turn of the 20th century with this mural, covering thousands and thousands of years of pre-human and human history in the process. And I want to mention that this mural is only available for public viewing when there's no trial in session or hearing happening, because this is still a functioning courtroom. So that's again why we are so adamant about building a virtual New Deal art museum, and why I'm especially excited to be here today doing this presentation in this virtual format. I'm not actually sure how many people or how many Gallupians have had the opportunity to see this mural in person. But we're going to take that opportunity right now, and we're going to start with just a nice, long, slow look at this mural. It covers all 4 walls of the courtroom. It starts in the northeast corner and wraps around the room clockwise. So that's what we'll do. We'll do kind of a pan view around the room, pausing on each section and each wall so that you can really soak it in. And take time to look and take time to think about form and content. Look for color and line work, and also pay attention to subject matter and what figures and what stories Moylan is evoking in this mural. All right, so now that you've had a chance to familiarize or acquaint yourself with this mural, let's discuss it. And I'll break our discussion into those 2 categories of form and content, starting with form. And I'd like to begin with an observation that most people make right away when they see this mural, or a question that we're often asked when we do tours of it or presentations on it, and that has to do with the limited color palette and the muted tones, and why Moylan might have made those artistic choices. We don't have a lot of primary source material on this mural. We don't have really any documentations of we don't have any documentation of Moylan's creative process, but I think the explanations for the color choices are pretty intuitive, starting with the fact that Moylan most likely had just a matter of months to complete this mural. The historic McKinley County Courthouse is actually itself a work of New Deal art. It was built through the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and it was dedicated in 1938. That's when the cornerstone was laid. Moylan painted this mural in 1941. So construction on the building was complete, and it actually was entirely furnished, and Moylan came in and created this mural right before the building opened for business and opened to the public. So a short time frame, and again, the scale of the mural, the need to cover 2,000 square feet of wall space, those constraints don't necessarily lend themselves to a high level of detail, and they put a more varied color palette a little bit out of reach. So it was a practical consideration, the colored choices. Another practical consideration that Moylan made, and the reason for the muted tones, is that obviously he was aware that he was creating a mural for a functioning courtroom. And something more bold, more vibrant, more colorful would perhaps be distracting from the business of the court. So he was keeping the use of the space in mind. Toward that end, the one place that he deviates from his color palette and uses more vivid hues is when he paints the American flag, which he does in bright blue and bright red, obviously accurate colors. And I think, again, Moylan chose to do that, recognizing the fact that this mural was created for a government building and wanting to give the flag proper treatment, given that fact. So Moylan's use of color is instructive, and it leads us into a deeper, more extended discussion of the composition of this mural. In 1941, when Moylan made the mural, he was a pretty accomplished muralist. He had a couple decades of mural making experience under his belt by that point. I'll just do the Cliff Notes version of his biography for context. He was born in 1893 in Minneapolis. He studied art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art and then in New York City. He originally came west to care for his ailing mother, and he first lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where he taught at the Broadmoor Art Academy. He did mural work in Colorado Springs, and a commission for a hotel there involved research trips to Taos. And those trips inspired Moylan to move to Alcalde, which is close to Taos, in the early 1930s. And then his career really took off under the New Deal. He was employed by different New Deal art programs to paint murals across the state. He painted murals for Eastern New Mexico University in Portales. He painted murals for Highlands University in Las Vegas. He painted murals for hotels in Albuquerque. One contemporary art critic and architect at the time called Moylan, quote, the closest thing to an American Michelangelo. And I will leave it up to you whether or not you agree with that assessment. But in any case, Moylan was one of the state's more prominent muralists by the late 1930s, early 1940s. And in 1941, he harnessed that experience and channeled it into doing some philosophizing around mural making. He wrote an essay outlining the principles of good public art and good public murals in particular for the Federal Art Project. And so this mural isn't just the crown jewel of our collection, it's also the crowning achievement of Moylan's career. It was his last New Deal mural commission. The New Deal ended shortly after 1941. I think, based on my research, it was his last public mural commission in general. And it fully executes and fully exemplifies Moylan's capacities as a muralist and the qualities of a good mural as he outlined them in his essay. Moylan did continue to paint after the New Deal, but his career transitioned and he became the administrator for what we now call the Wheelwright Museum in Santa Fe. He served in that position from 1942 to 1954 when Mary Wheelwright dismissed him, unfortunately due to his drinking problem, and his career had pretty much stagnated by that point, and he died just a decade later. So back to 1941, he was at the apex of his career, and this mural is a full realization of his vision as a muralist. And the first principle of good public art or good murals that Moylan lays out in his Federal Art Project essay is that they should be made in dialogue with the space that they inhabit. They should be made to reflect the space. They should be made to kind of embrace the space. Murals, in other words, should be site-specific. And we can see how that idea plays out in this courtroom mural with the ways in which Moylan incorporates the architectural features of the room into his design. And a great example are the ceiling beams. And the ceiling beams would have been in place, obviously, when Moylan began work on this mural. And what he did, as you can see on the east wall, is he took the ceiling beams and he used them to kind of dictate his imagery in some sense, and the ceiling beams flow seamlessly into the adobe architecture that he pictures, and they become incorporated into the scene. They become part of the imagery in that manner. He does the same thing with the decorative woodwork around the room, and the best example is here on the south wall. The top edge of I can point to this one. The top edge of the door frame becomes the grounding for this figure's foot. And in that sense, the woodwork is absorbed into the image. So in just with those two examples, you can see how Moylan is making use of the architecture of the room. He takes the concept one step further, and he very cleverly uses the corners of the room to indicate major turning points in Southwestern history. So starting in the northeast corner, we move from pre-human history and dinosaurs to human history and the history of ancient cultures and indigenous cultures in our region. And then the next corner takes us from the pre-contact period into the period of European colonization. And then moving into the southwest corner, we go from the colonial period to the period of Western exploration and expansion. And then rounding the room, the last corner marks a major turning point in Southwest history with the coming of the railroad. Moylan further breaks down and further delineates the timeline of Southwestern history using the doorways and the decorative woodwork in the room. So we'll go back to the east wall. And there isn't anything special on the east wall. There's no door and there's no decorative woodwork. There's just the wood paneling. But what Moylan did was he painted in a doorway, and then he painted in a stepped wall to kind of mirror what's happening on the opposite wall, on the west wall, with the decorative work above the judge's bench. And he liked to do that. There's a couple of examples of that in this mural where he painted in architectural symmetry. But what happens is that the doorway that he paints in becomes the dividing line between ancient cultures like hunter-gatherer history and pre-contact cultures, like more sedentary societies in the history of those indigenous cultures in the area. On the south wall, the doorway it distinguishes between the period of Spanish colonization of the region and the period of American colonization. And then the decorative work over the judge's bench on the west wall marks the shift from Western exploration and the gold rush and fur trapping into the period of Western settlement and development. And so we see that this mural is fully in situ. This mural fully belongs to the space, and the space kind of fully belongs to it. And there's that symbiosis happening, and you couldn't extract this mural from this room and put it somewhere else. And the room itself becomes part of the mural as well. And another layer of site specificity is added, of course, with the subject matter. Moylan's telling the history of this exact location. And we'll get into subject matter in just a minute. But here I want to pause, and I want to think a little bit about how the form and the structure of the narrative that Moylan accomplishes, how those things influence and impact our understanding of the narrative. And Moylan, he does a beautiful job, but the history as he tells it in a kind of systematic fashion, in this very rhythmic fashion. He relays the events as if they happen in a very logical progression, kind of a step-by-step manner. And that sense of inevitability, or those undertones of advancement, are pretty typical of histories as written by the quote-unquote victors. And they privilege a certain perspective, and when we begin to recognize them, we see the biases at play in that perspective. So oftentimes, histories written by victors are written in such a way to justify the outcome, or to lend it a sense of credibility, or a sense that the series of events, the sequences of events was kind of natural and meant to be, and again, inevitable. And that's what's happening, the way that Moylan structures and frames his narrative in this space. That leads us into a discussion of the subject matter, of the content of Moylan's version of historical events. The second principle of good public art or good murals that Moylan espouses in his Federal Art Project essay is that they should, quote, bring to the surface what is growth-provoking in the spirit of humanity. And I will argue that Moylan accomplishes that objective with this mural. I will argue that this mural is, for its time, relatively progressive. That is not to say that it is a perfect rendition of history, if such a thing exists. But for the year 1941, Moylan's version of Southwest history is more progressive than most. And one of the best examples I can point to is how he treats the story of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. He gives it pride of place in this mural. He pictures it right here, right above where I'm standing, on the center of the south wall. He paints it above the doorway in a location where the viewer's eye is naturally drawn, and he makes it a focal point of his narrative. And that is unusual. The Pueblo Revolt is an often glanced over event in terms of today's history textbooks, so I'm not sure it would have been given any better treatment in history textbooks of the 1940s. And so by not just including it, but by emphasizing it, Moylan kind of goes against the tide. Now, of course, he doesn't tell the history from the Pueblo perspective, not that he could. But he doesn't show Pope, the revolutionary leader. He doesn't illustrate how the different Pueblo communities came together and overcame language barriers to organize a successful revolt. Instead, he shows scenes of scalping, which kind of plays into some stereotypes. I mean, by all accounts, scalping did occur, but to focus on those facts instead of others, again, is taking a kind of Euro-American-centric perspective. But by virtue of including the event and even more so by spotlighting it, I think Moylan does better than we could probably expect for 1941. Likewise, he documents the resilience of Native peoples in this mural. And he shows, despite the best efforts of colonization, that Native people were able to continue to maintain and sustain and even grow their artistic, their cultural, and their spiritual traditions in the reservation period. So he shows silversmithing, he shows weaving, he shows the Zuni Shalico, all occurring during the reservation era. And again, that's cutting against the grain in some significant ways. If we put ourselves back in the mindset of the 1940s, the kind of American popular imagination or the popular conception was that Native Americans were quote unquote defeated. And there was actually a lot of ironic sentimentality around the loss of indigenous cultures or indigenous traditions in our country. But Moylan doesn't toe that line. Instead, he shows Native peoples how they survived and even in some ways thrived, again, despite the best efforts of colonization. And I'll just repeat that that doesn't mean that Moylan is immune from stereotypes in this mural or stereotypical thinking. He's definitely not. Probably most notably in his pictures of pre-contact cultures, he focuses on intertribal warfare between the Navajo and Puebloan peoples. And he totally ignores, for instance, the incredible architectural achievements and trading accomplishments of the Chacoan society. But I do think that Moylan was striving and doing his best and attempting a more nuanced and more inclusive and more representative version of events with this mural. I get the impression that he had his mind and his eyes open somehow to non-dominant perspectives. And I think there's a couple of ways that could have happened. Moylan, as I mentioned briefly earlier, was an associate of Mary Wheelwright's. He actually was a pretty close associate and a close collaborator of hers. They were next door neighbors in a sense. Mary Wheelwright lived in Alcalde, where Moylan lived. And her whole life's work, her life's mission was to document and preserve Navajo ceremonies and songs and traditions. And she befriended a famed medicine man or ceremonial singer, Hosting Claw. And she worked with him to create books and then eventually start a museum. The Wheelwright Museum is what we now call it. She called it the Museum of Navajo Ceremonial Art. Moylan, as I said, ran her museum for its first 12 years. He also illustrated a book for Mary Wheelwright. So my hunch is that he accompanied her on some of her visits to this area. Perhaps he met Hosting Claw, perhaps he attended Navajo ceremonies, perhaps he engaged in some of that dialogue. That's pure speculation on my part. I think it's likely that it occurred, and maybe that's what shaped or reshaped Moylan's thinking about Southwest history. Even if that didn't happen, let's keep in mind that Gallup has had a front row seat to the major events of Southwest history, to the events that Moylan depicts in this mural. And when we think about it, 1941 was not that far removed from some of these events. It was only a lifetime, 3/4 of a century after the Long Walk of 1864. And I would hazard a guess that there were people living in the Gallup area in 1941 who experienced that event and some other events firsthand or very close to firsthand. And again, maybe Moylan had some of those conversations, or maybe it was just kind of a general awakening due to his experiences out here and due to the fact that this history in our community isn't history in the sense of it being like an artifact or something really of the past. It's living and breathing in the people and the communities that call this area home. And probably the best piece of evidence I have that Moylan was attempting, again, something more nuanced, something more inclusive, something more representative with this mural, is how he portrays Navajo internment at Bosque Redondo. So if we pan over there, you can see what he shows is a group of women huddled at the feet of 2 U.S. Army soldiers holding rifles. And what's kind of remarkable about this is that one of the women turns and she looks over her shoulder. And when you're standing in this space, your gaze meets hers, and she makes eye contact with the viewer, as if to implicate the viewer in the scene or in the event itself. And she's kind of also interestingly looking at the jury box of the courtroom, which I think is kind of maybe a metaphor. And when you think about who the audience would have been for this mural in 1941, it would have been a mostly white audience. Gallup was pretty segregated in the early 1940s. And so that implication would have been pretty radical, I think. Other evidence that demonstrates how progressive Moylan's mural is, relatively speaking, is to compare it to other historical murals made during the same period. And in Gallup, we have a mural, or a series of murals of Southwest history made by an artist named J.R. Willis in 1936 for the Gallup Public Schools. And those are part of the New Deal art collection. They were commissioned through the Public Works of Art project. And they still hang today in the Gallup High School library. And Willis's murals stand in stark contrast to Lloyd Moylan's. They are rife with stereotypes, one of the most obvious being that Willis portrays Navajo people in buckskin clothing, which of course is inaccurate. But I think it's obviously intentional. It was an artistic choice, and I think it was meant to evoke stereotypical thinking, like the trope of cowboys and Indians, which is problematic. Another fruitful comparison to make is Moylan's mural as it can be seen, or as it's viewed, and as it was described in a very lengthy newspaper article written by Ruth Kirk for the Gallup Independent in 1941 when the courthouse opened. Kirk's article uses highly derogatory language such as savage and marauding Indians as 2 examples. I'm not sure if Moylan saw or read her article, but I don't think he would have appreciated it if he had, because he had a more sympathetic he had a sympathetic nature towards the Native perspective, and even though, again, he could never fully represent it or do it justice, I think he was trying to give glimpses of it into this mural, or give some insight, his insight that he had gained into it, and he was trying to, in maybe subtle ways, but still trying to challenge some preconceptions and challenge the norms and challenge kind of the standard way of thinking for his time. So ultimately, what I believe is that this mural shows Moylan's growth in individual understanding, and it's his best attempt to communicate that understanding to a wider audience, and in that way accomplish what he thought murals should aspire to do and bring about what is growth-provoking in the spirit of humanity. And it's at this point that I totally regret that we can't open this up for a conversation and dialogue, and I can't hear your thoughts and opinions and ideas and questions because of this virtual format. The best I can do is to invite you to engage with us online. We have information about the Gallup New Deal Art Project on gallupARTS website, which is galluparts.org. We do presentations and tours, and you can find more information on that at galluparts.org. Gallup Arts is on Facebook and Instagram. Just search for Gallup Arts. That's our handle, and you'll find us. Leave us some messages or comments. And then stay tuned. Follow us on social media or sign up for our newsletter on our website, because the Gallup New Deal Art Project is ongoing. It's been a bit behind the scenes because we're building a prototype and building a website. But once we're able, for sure, to do in-person events and programming again, we will go back to doing public presentations around the New Deal Art Collection. And we really hope you'll engage with us as this project continues to evolve, because as I think you can see with Lloyd Moylan's mural, again, it tells us a lot about where we come from, and it's a great opportunity to think together about where we are and where we want to go. And so please stay tuned. And thank you, everyone, so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I love looking at and talking about Moylan's mural. So thank you again. Thank you to the Octavia Flynn Public Library for putting this on. Thank you to Suzanne Hammonds for doing the filming. And I hopefully will see everybody soon. Take care and stay safe.